Hello, everyone. Okay, I wasn't sure. Okay. Interpretation is available on this call in Spanish. To access that, please click on the globe in the bottom right hand corner of your screen. If you don't see the globe, choose the three dots and then interpretation. Choose Spanish and you will hear the interpretation instead of the main audio. Tenemos interpretación en español disponible para este webinario. Para accesarlo, por favor, da clic en el globo que se encuentra del lado derecho en la parte baja de tu pantalla. Si no ves el globo, haz clic en los tres puntos y escoge interpretación. Escoge español y empezarás a escuchar el programa en español en vez de el audio principal. Hello, everyone, and welcome to funding of Black-led groups, Philanthropy, Afro-Latinidad, and the Fight for Racial Justice. I want to give a shout out first to HIP and to NCRP for partnering to share their platform and for inviting me to facilitate this important conversation on the Afro-Latin diaspora. I also want to thank our panelists today for being generous with their time and sharing their knowledge with us. My name is Cristel Caballero Saucedo. I prefer she, her pronouns. I am located in Lenape Nation land, also known as New York by many. I wear many hats today. I am the program officer for the Racial Equity and Philanthropy Fund at Borealis Philanthropy. I am a founder and principal at Living Change Coach Practice. And I am a HIP Leaders alumni, so shout out to my Leaders Network. Woot, woot. All right, let's get started. If the panelists could you please share your name with us, pronouns, role, organization, native, location, so how do we understand? I'm going to start with Jonathan first.
Hi, my name is Jonathan J. Green, and I'm the Vice President of Programs at the Margaret Casey Foundation, and my pronouns are they, them. And I am calling from the Duwamish land, otherwise known as Seattle. I want to thank you all so much for having this conversation, and thank HIB and NCRP for hosting it, and Giselle, thank you for being the moderator.
Thank you. Claribel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Claribel Vidal. I am the Program Associate on the Civic Engagement and Government team at the Ford Foundation. My pronouns are she, her, and I am also, like Cristel, calling from the Lenape land, also known as New York City, repping for my native New Yorkers. And I'm just super excited to this is what I live and breathe, these conversations. So to be in a professional setting where we can just have the real talk, I'm super excited to HIP and CRP for having us. So thank you.
Thank you. Sean?
Yep. Good morning, everyone. Sean Escoffery, the Executive Director of the Rory and Patricia Disney Family Foundation. I'm normally based in Los Angeles, but I'm here in San Francisco, so I actually don't know exactly where I am. in terms of lands. I am, my pronouns are he, him.
Thank you. So I do have one request for all of you. If you could please, whenever I ask a question or you want to share something with us, if you could just start by sharing your name. So I actually want to start us off with a question that I have been seeing virtually in Afro-Latin American spaces. And there's actually a couple of questions, right? The first one is, what is Latinidad? And is it, or why might it be considered anti-Black? Jonathan, could you please lead us off?
Yes, happy to. Thank you so much for the question. And also, what a complex question. I think I want to first of all credit some of the activists and organizers who have been leading us in this conversation around questioning and challenging Latinidad, including activists like Alan Peláez Lopez and Janelle Martinez from Ena Latina. I think I want to be able to credit them in this conversation. But where I am at today is believing that Latinidad has been a socially constructed identity with the alleged goal of uniting people from Latin America under a homogeneous cultural, racial, economic, and social identity. And in reality, it's been often used as a measure of proximity to whiteness, in which those least threatening to white supremacy are seen as the default, worthy to be celebrated at the expense of those of us at the margins that might be Black, Indigenous, queer, and trans communities. And we have to be honest about the roots and the impact, regardless of how we might have personally associated with the identity, and also how we may have benefited from it and the warm and fuzzy feelings that we may have with some of the cultural traditions. What's fascinating to me is that so many of those same cultural traditions, including music like salsa and merengue, originated by Black people that yet are somehow not credited or included in this of Latinidad, right? And from there, I think once we are clear about this origin and its impact, we have to determine like what to do about it, right? So do we choose the path of reforming and rebranding Latinidad so that Black people like me and other folks at the margin can actually be included? Or do we choose to betray Latinidad, which has been one of the calls that Alan has issued to many of us, and really committing to the larger principles of freedom and liberation. And then there's so many ways and terms that folks use, whether it's Afro-Latinx or Black Latin Americans or Latinx, Latinx. And oftentimes they get co-opted, if we are going to be honest. For me, I identify as Afro-Latinx, but for me, I'm really clear that the most important part of my identity is my commitment to my Blackness. Blackness, not just as a racial and social identity, but as a political identity. Black as a member of the global Black struggle and movement for justice and freedom. And for me, that Blackness is inseparable from my ancestry and journey through Panama. That Blackness is inseparable from my queer and gender non-conforming identities. The reality is that same Blackness, the beauty of it is that it's so expansive, powerful, and complex. And it is that same reason why it is a threat to white supremacy across the world, which is why we must commit to ending it.
Thank you so much. Would Claribel or Sean want to pitch in?
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add is also, I think yes, and plus one to everything that you just said, but also naming up front, if we're gonna dive into the conversation, that as Latinos, Latinx community members, that we both experience racism, but we also perpetuate it, right? So let's like just kind of like park that, name it, so that when we dive in deep, we can talk about the paradoxes of that and hold it. Yeah, that's the only thing I would add for now.
Yeah, and I'd also say that there's sort of no right answer in terms of how we're defining or creating new definitions, because everyone's coming to the conversation from from very different spaces, and it's very nuanced. Whether or not you acknowledge or accept, I do think like we have to push the conversation around Afro and African and Blackness, to make sure that it is front and center.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you mentioning that white supremacy like permeates, right, like our understanding and the racial understanding of Latinidad as well. That is something that it's prevalent, and that because of that, sometimes it is raised to the bottom, right? You can be oppressed and also be the oppressor, colorism being one of the ways that this happens. And still we all lose for practicing white supremacy. So it's important to, as you mentioned, shift the way that we engage with one another within the framework of Latinidad, and also when we talk about racial solidarity. So I know that Jonathan mentioned, you already shared with us how you identify. I want to leave space for Sean and Claribel to share a little bit about how you identify. I think this is important. That's why I asked the first question, to get us a bit contextualized. Yeah, Claribel, do you want to lead us out?
Sure, I can lead. So I think the way that I've identified is fluid. It changes, and it's changed throughout my own journey of understanding my Afro-Latinidad. I'm a Caribeña, I am Dominicana, and I'm an Afro-Latina. And how that all has impacted my experience, both personally and professionally, while also understanding, like Jonathan mentioned earlier, certain privileges that I have access to, right? And contending with those realities has been really important, I think, for my own journey. And for my own journey and understanding how I want to show up in spaces around Blackness, whether it's in family conversations, whether it's at funder tables. And so I hold all of those different identities. And I also am not married to any of those identities. I understand that maybe in the next 10 years that can change. And I welcome the ability, and I think this is why these conversations are so important. I welcome the ability to expand and use some of these identities as an access point to go deeper in understanding the African diaspora and understanding the impact that colonialism has had on land, people, culture, and language, and so forth. So I'll leave it there, and we can dive in a little deeper later.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us, because I feel like that's something that folks are experiencing, especially within the Latinx diaspora, as you know, they come into understanding their history, the contextual way in which colorism shows up in how you identify. A lot of folks are diving into that internal conversation. I appreciate you sharing that with us. How about you, Sean?
Well, so I am Jamaican American, and just West Indian American, but my grandfather is actually from Panama, and the Escoffery name, you know, is actually decently big in Panama, surprisingly. So, you know, there's some research that I need to be doing, and you know, just to better understand some of my roots in Panama.
Thank you.
Can I add something?
Go ahead, Jonathan.
I love that you brought that up, because I think, well, a variety of reasons. The story of Black people in Panama is so connected to the story of Black people in Jamaica. You know, like, honestly, we're all so connected, right? Thinking about the forces of migration, the forces of capitalism, you know, the building of the Panama Canal. There's such a storied history there. But I think what you mentioning that brought up for me is really talking about how at times the boundaries of Latinidad feel so arbitrary and intentional at the same time, right? Like, that we may not think of Jamaicans and Haitians as Afro-Latinx people, and our communities are so tied and there's such a close bond, and folks at times might not think about Brazilians and people from Belize as Afro-Latinx people, even, like, you know, I think there's just lots of question there about both how arbitrary it can feel, but also how intentional it is about its proximity to whiteness and everything else being othered, that I just wanted to just make sure we didn't lose that.
Yeah, which it's a perfect leeway to my next question. To understand the history of Latin America is to understand the Latinx community as a conversation about intersectionality, right? Like different experiences. It's about migration, immigration, diversity in experiences of like ability or disability, gender identity, multiracial experience. So my question to you is, how does racial solidarity look like within the Latin American community, and where is there space to strengthen a coalition through an intersectional framework with the Latin American community, but also within the Latin American community, similar to the Rainbow Coalition in Chicago, led by Black Panther Chairman Fred Hampton, and the work of the Panthers to support disabilities justice work. It's a full question, so I'm gonna ask Hashan to start us off.
That is a big question. Wow. Okay. So, I think, to the first part of the question, it's pretty much a work in progress, right? In terms of identifying, a common challenge or a common enemy. We can talk about white supremacy, but it's not necessarily, I don't know if everyone will focus there, right? And since the community is so broad, there has to be a lot of building, right, to come at to really find that common enemy to give us something to focus on. I can sort of talk about it a little bit from philanthropy's perspective. We have a tough time funding things that are intersectional. We have a tough time thinking in an intersectional way. Most of our programs and foundations are divided into program areas, and they're siloed, based on a host of things. But the folks inside, we're not necessarily thinking that same way. The Fred Hampton story, there was a lot of building happening. There was a common enemy of the police and the government, and the oppression that was common for poor white folks, for Latino folks, for Black folks, and that's a particular moment in time. And I think a lot of those things exist today, but the water is pretty muddy. And it's harder for, I think, a lot of folks to see the commonality when we spend more time sort of focusing on individual struggles.
That's right. Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah, so 2 things. One, on the solidarity piece, part of why I talked about me identifying as a member of a global Black struggle, is because I deeply believe that the fight that I and we at the Margaret Casey Foundation are committing to is the fight for racial justice, right? A fight for a world where Black people, both home and abroad, are free, and we know that when Black people are free, that everyone else is free as a result, because our struggles are linked, right? And when we talk about racial justice, to me, there is no racial justice without trans liberation, without economic justice, environmental justice. So I think by having a broad enough but specific enough commitment to racial justice in this broad sense that includes everyone, I think that is like a helpful framework to base the work, right? Because then that way we know that we have to do work across our community, intra-community, all across the board. So I think that's one piece. The second piece that Sean just brought up around program areas in philanthropy in particular, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this, particularly as we at the Margaret Casey Foundation are talking about strategy and thinking about sort of how we are refining and responding to this moment. And one of the things that I love is that our foundation is, at times is described as like issue agnostic, or like we fund across issue areas and we don't have defined buckets. But that at times misses the actual through line of how we're thinking about this. And I think what we're actually focused on, what we're trying to get really clear about, is actually power, right? Like whether or not folks are building power in different issue areas, what we actually care is working towards this vision of racial justice, where people who have been excluded and exploited by our economy and government have the ability to set the rules for these systems, have the ability to govern, to make decisions that govern their lives, right? So when we think about it from that perspective, then I think that makes a lot more space for our communities to be included.
Thank you. I'm gonna leave space for Claribel to share anything.
Yes. I would add two things too. One is that I appreciate this question because we often don't hear about examples of multiracial solidarity, and I think that that is intentional. And if we do hear about it, we only hear about the fallout. We don't hear about the wins. We don't hear about the collective power that was harnessed. And sometimes we don't even hear about the backlash that our own government has taken a front center involvement in dismantling these alliances. And it's important to name that because I think that as we talk about and we want to understand and we want to fund, we have to understand the history of this very intentional separation and this very intentional attack around cross-issue and racial solidarity. And I think for me, like if you look at the facts, like the Rainbow Coalition, for example, was founded in the spring of 1969. In December of that same year, Fred Hampton was murdered by the FBI and the Chicago police, right? That's very intentional. So what do we know? We know that power in people and communities, to the point that Jonathan made, that when folks come together and demand justice, that is where there's real change, and that is where the threat is, right? And so as funders, how do we then continue to support? And we're asking folks at the end of the day to unlearn things that we all named in the beginning. Our cultures are deeply embedded in colorism, white supremacy, and we're asking them to also take risks with their bodies, with their communities, with their lives. So then how do we as funders take some bold actions and fund differently and show up differently? And I think one of the main ingredients I would say to coalition building is having a common interest and a common struggle. And to the point that Sean made, I think often as funders, we tend to fund in a way where it's so specific to like the issues, or even it's so specific to a certain community that it creates this dynamic where groups are not working on the issues that activate them, the issues that are going to actually allow for that alliance building. They're just working on the issues that are being funded. And so how do we then not perpetuate some of that same harm and some of that dynamic, and how do we fund the people, like Jonathan said, and fund what's activating them, what is coming from the community and is being led by the community?
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, I just want to jump in. Those are great points, and I think also it goes beyond just the funding, right? It's about the data that we're capturing, right? And what do we have? What are they reporting out on? I think a lot of times we celebrate the victories around policies being passed, right? And there's all these wins, right? It's all about the wins, and I think we need to celebrate the coalition, right? Celebrate the work of actually bringing groups together. We need to report out on that. That needs to be a part of the metrics conversation, and that that definitely requires the field of philanthropy to change, and for the higher ups to understand that it's not just a measurable outcome of a bill being passed, but it's we should be measuring the actual formation of a coalition and what power actually looks like.
Thank you so much. So I just take 3 points out of that. One, that Black liberation is freedom for all. Two, that because there's an intentional practice to separate or dismantle coalitions, it is important for us to intentionally invest in supporting the coalitions that are organically being built even to today. And then 3, that we have to think about the ecosystem when we think about the way that we fund, right? It's about how do we engage with evaluation, what is the storytelling that we're sharing out to the world in terms of our practice and what we're seeing happening in the grassroots level. And that it's important to celebrate coalition building, to be able to actually change the narrative about what are the outcomes, right? Because it's important to recognize that where there's people, there's power, and that should always be the message, right? And you all actually have helped me go lead this conversation to the next question, which is, I often hear folks in the sector speak about investments in the Latin American community and Black community in a way that renders that intersections of Blackness and Latinidad invisible. How can people in the sector talk about investing in the Latinx community and the African American community in a way that both considers and honors the nuances of the Latin American experiences, but also understands that these communities have similarities in experiences and also differences? And I will let Claribel start us off.
Sure. So I have to admit, I cringe when I hear those conversations. And I think we've already talked about some of the reasons why that approach can be very problematic. I'll name very explicitly, like often Latinx work is often rendered only to immigration issues, right? When we know that there are bold Latinx leaders that are working on reproductive, education, voter engagement, disability rights, and so forth, and all kinds of work. And the same applies to Black-led efforts. And so when I hear conversations around like, do we fund this like Latinx work or do we fund this Black-led effort? To me, what it indicates is that the grant makers lack real talk and understanding of how systemic racism impacts BIPOC, LGBTQ, and disabled communities. It's a very narrow and limiting way of understanding these communities. And I would argue that like many other identities, whether it's queerness, whether it's Afro-Latinidad, it's another way to complicate and expand our understanding of intersectionality and Blackness and white supremacy. And for me, I think about Afro-Latinidad as an access point to these conversations, to expand our understanding, to avoid putting people in boxes. And I think to the conversation we were just having a few minutes ago, the power of, again, around multiracial solidarity and the intentionality throughout history, starting with colonialism in separating and creating a hierarchy around whiteness, and I just think it just carries out in all parts of our lives and in the structures that we all interact with. So I think naming that and complicating things is good. And the Afro-Latinidad experience is one that even as an Afro-Latina, I can't speak to every other Afro-Latin identifying person's experience, because I also recognize I am a light-skinned Afro-Latina and I can't talk for my Black and brown sisters, right? And so it's a starting point that hopefully allows us to expand our own thinking and complicate and contradict a lot of the things that we've been taught.
Sean?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Yeah, that the multiracial solidarity sort of funding conversation. It's interesting because we don't fund it. And we typically talk about it, but it's talked about in the context of other work, right? So we're approaching it from different angles, and it's an add-on. But I don't see a lot of just funding for this multiracial solidarity work. I work in LA, and we have shifting neighborhoods. we have Black neighborhoods that are now Latino neighborhoods, and infrastructure that is usually it's slower to progress, right? So you have Black organizations in now a Latino neighborhood, and there's definitely conversations that need to happen, and a lot of building work that needs to happen in terms of making sure that everyone sees themselves, right, and that there isn't the challenge around difference and resentments, and so it's stuff that I think philanthropy can do a better job at, just funding this type of work, the conversations that need to happen to galvanize and to find those common threads that we can all build power around.
Thank you. Anything you would like to add, Jonathan?
Yes, I am so grateful to my panelists because I definitely want to plus one to what they've shared, and particularly Claribel's points around complicating the like boxes that at times we in philanthropy love for ourselves. Is so important because to me, this question underscores the limits of the politics of representation, right? So oftentimes when we're talking about these things, we're measuring this funding by either the leadership of the organization, be it the ED, senior leader, and or the board. So if they are, whatever the box is, then that's like a funding we might consider. Or the second category is usually thinking about the community served. So, if they're serving this particular community, whether it's measured by like members or like hours spent, whatever the measurement of the flavor of the day when it comes to measurement, that is like the second category. But I think that's usually where the conversation ends. And to me, these are really important markers, but they are the floor, right? Like everyone should be having these conversations and considering these things. And there's more, right? Like the two things that I would love to see much more represented are, one, a conversation about strategies, right? Like for us at the Marguerite Casey Foundation, we deeply believe in funding community organizing, both, yes, because it is drastically underfunded, but because we are focused on building power, and we know that community organizing is where power is built, right? So like, what does it look like to make funding commitments based on the folks who are doing the really hard work of building power for our communities across the country? So that's one. And then the second, which I know that it might be a little bit uncomfortable for some folks, but it's really around ideology. I think there is this story that folks in philanthropy are non-ideological, which is absolutely not true. I think more often than not, folks in philanthropy, foundations, corporations have really perpetrated a really neoliberal view of our society, right? Like thinking and supporting projects that confuse, right, the role of the state for the role of philanthropy. We're really clear at the Marguerite Casey Foundation that we're trying to build a country and a world where our communities have power, and that means that philanthropy cannot be the substitute for a functioning state. We need a state that provides for the basic needs of our communities, that provides housing when needed, that provides healthcare, right? Like really basic things that are not happening, that the state is failing our people. We are focused on funding the kind of strategies that have that kind of view towards racial justice and liberation. And that might even be abolitionist work across the country. And I think that oftentimes doesn't get talked about, or definitely doesn't get funded as much, but I think are equally important to talk about within this broader range of representation.
Thank you so much. You bring really good points in terms of the importance of investing in the power that exists within the communities, right? And also the existence of racialized capitalism, which leads me to the next question around scarcity mindset. When it comes to investing in BIPOC communities, we have heard the the philanthropic sector use a false narrative of dollar scarcity. As a result, a culture of competition is created by grant makers themselves. In your experience, what talking points have been useful to present a counter narrative to the myth of dollar scarcity? And also while advocating to fund Afro-Latin American-led organizations and the coalition work that that we've been discussing. And I'll ask Sean to start us off.
This is something I think about a lot, and I think it is a nuanced conversation, right? So there's a reality that there are limited dollars, there are a limited number of foundations, et cetera, but there's enough dollars in a certain way, and then not nearly enough to actually fund all the work that needs to be done, and in a consistent way, right? I don't like to talk about scarcity, when it's about communities of color and groups led by people of color. For me, we focus on funding the work in the communities that we're focusing on, East LA and South LA primarily. We're focusing on communities of color, and we're focused on groups that are led by people in those communities. We shouldn't be having this conversation about sort of competition, but for nonprofits, I come from the nonprofit sector, so I do realize that we're all, for the most part, looking at some of the same dollars, some of the same foundations, or our development teams are scouring the universe to find resources to fund programs. It's not healthy to think about it from a scarcity perspective, but there's also this reality that dollars or foundations themselves and opportunities are actually limited.
Thank you, Jonathan. Or Sean, I'm gonna ask Jonathan to follow the conversation.
Thank you. I love that you asked this question because it is one that I think a lot about, particularly within the context of the political experiment that the right has led for the past few decades, leading to a dismantling of our democracy and of our courts and our judicial systems. Like the fact that folks on the right had the ability to plan and build a multi-decade strategy, but also have the resources to back that up and to be able to bring that to bear. It makes me think, what would the possibilities be if our people had the resources that they need to be able to carry out their vision, not just for the next year and the next 2 years and this next grant cycle, but the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 20 years, right? So I think when we talk about this conversation about scarcity when it comes to dollars, my question is usually like, what is the goal? What is our goal? What are we trying to do here? Are we trying to build power? Yes or no? Because if the answer is yes, then we need to not only resource our communities fully from philanthropy, but also make it our job to raise additional resources from other places, right? Like, yes, our particular foundation has a set foundation, like a grant-making budget, and also we have all these other ways that we could continue to help them raise additional resources from other places, and also think about influence, the ways in which we as a foundation can throw our weight behind their ideas that might be considered as risky, or whatever the flavor of the month is around like why people don't believe in the strategies from our communities, particularly when it comes to organizing. But I think there's a way to both acknowledge the reality of budgeting and grant making, and also while setting our eyes to building power, expanding our imagination and pushing ourselves, right? Like communities on the ground are already stretching $1 in 25 ways. How about we as folks in philanthropy pushing ourselves to be of greater service towards this goal and this vision of racial justice?
Thank you, Jonathan. I'll pass it to Claribel if you want to add anything.
Yes. So very tangible. My response usually is focus on the people power, right? So to Jonathan's point, like what is the purpose? And at Forward and on the civic engagement and government team we're all about the people power. We're all about not just the representation, but civic participation, and for folks who are left out of these systems to be able to shape and influence the policies and the systems that basically impact their lives. And so explicitly, it's focused on people power, community-led efforts. And the reason why is what we've, in our experience and what our grant-making analysis and our evaluation shows is that the work that's led by young people, that's led by BIPOC, LGBTQ, that's led by disability justice groups, it's always applies an intersectional approach, right? And so whether there may be some constraints within our own institutions and our own funding, when you invest in the people who are impacted the most and have the solutions and the ideas, like that is the way to kind of like get out the way and allow the work to happen. And I would say also, the last thing I would add is that oftentimes we talk about philanthropy in this very like arbitrary like sector thing. We don't talk about the people. And as a young professional, as an Afro-Latina in philanthropy, I've worked in philanthropy, don't kind of want to admit it, but probably 6+ years. And what I've noticed is that oftentimes the Black and brown and women and queer voices of those funders of the support staff that's trying to push the institutions beyond their comfort zone, that work is from those folks is usually erased. And so I wanted, and I say that to say because there's an importance when you allow folks with lived experiences, when you allow them access to these decision-making powers from within, when you are promoting your young people, and within the philanthropic sector, you're going to see that the philanthropic sector is going to match and mirror the movement. And I think that in the last 5 years, there's been a lot that's happened in terms of an increase in BIPOC leadership in philanthropy. And I would say that more needs to happen if we want to mirror and have folks that really advocate for the work. Because you don't have to explain intersectionality to me, but I can explain it to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So summarizing real quick. Folks, remember to ask, what is the goal? What are the possibilities? Remember to focus on the people power, and remember to elevate the leadership that you have within your own institutions. The BIPOC leadership with intersectionality. All right, so let's get to my last question before we open it up to our audience. What I have learned from doing racial justice work is that it is people work. And because we're talking about people, it is important to talk about justice work as a way of being, right? What are three new habits practitioners can do to start practicing pro-Black lifestyles? And I'll start with Jonathan.
I love this question. I think the first one is doing your own work. I love that Claribel started with this acknowledgement that we actually weren't all just born woke, right? Or like have it all together from the get-go, and that it actually is a journey. And I think when I think about my own journey, even like embracing, like working on my internalized anti-Blackness, internalized like all of the things, right? I didn't just wake up having an analysis. Like I actually had to read, had to watch videos, had to be in community with people. And I think there is a freedom of owning that we don't have it all together, right? Like that there is so much more work to do. But it actually isn't like I actually cannot make those communities, like for example, like something that I'm working to continue to deepen my understanding and working with communities and Native communities, right? Like I can't go to Native leaders and be like, hey, educate me. I actually have to do that on my own, right? And I think at times it is helpful to people to like admit that we don't have it all together so that we know that we're all on this journey, but we have to do our very own work. I think the second thing is around accountability. And, you know, this is something that like all of us struggle with. And I think, you know, I think a lot about what it looks like to mess up, right? Because all of us the secret is all of us do. All of us will, if we haven't already somehow. And like, but what does it look like to own up to that and to rectify that and to make deeper commitments the next day, to be able to continue to work towards that vision of freedom that we're working towards. And then the last one for me, is thinking about what does it look like to embody and to lead and to work towards racial justice. I think it's really being in relationship, right? Like, I think there are oftentimes ways in which these jobs, our sector, it feels so transactional. It feels about like, all right, $5, $10, and that's the end of the conversation, when oftentimes the real work happens when you build meaningful, authentic relationships. And I know that right now it is hard in a pandemic, but I deeply value those. And, I think that is part of my commitment to my personal journey on racial justice.
Thank you, Claribel.
Same. I'm gonna copy you, Jonathan. So, I think, like I said earlier, the Latinx community cannot give themselves a pass on doing their own anti-Blackness work, and so you have to. Yes, we experience structural racism and oppression, but we also perpetuate white supremacy in our behavior, right? So you need to reflect. You need to educate yourself in your tios and your tias, recognizing that you also have to protect your peace because sometimes it's a bit much. And then I think also, yes, being in relationship, and while you're being in relationship, listening, right? Not saying, oh yeah, I can't I know what you're talking about. No, girl, like I actually don't know what you're talking about. I've never had to be able to admit, I've never had to think about that, even though I've experienced and can share some of the similar struggles. You have your own unique struggles, and I want to learn and I want to listen. So yeah, it's, I think, just like a true commitment to it.
Sean.
Yeah, I got to say ditto to both points, and just really also focusing on that authentic relationship. I think that has to be something that you're willing to do, right? And you have to be willing to be uncomfortable as well, right? Being uncomfortable in unfamiliar spaces, committed to actually learning a community, becoming friends. The first thing I did in LA when I moved here was I met every single organization that we were supporting in their place, right? I'm walking around their communities, I'm talking to strangers. People may look at me like I'm crazy, but I'm trying to understand the neighborhood and the community, and trying to start developing trust, right? And building trust. And I know that sort of takes time. But I think we're in a world where racial justice work is, it's, I guess, easy to be involved from a hashtag perspective, or from attending a rally. I think so many people, every time I was at a rally, I would talk to someone and ask them what are they doing tomorrow, right? We don't get to the tomorrow conversation. There's the witty sign, there is the anger, and the fight for solidarity and showing up, and then they go home, right? So it's really focusing on that tomorrow conversation, and what are you willing to change, and what are you willing to sacrifice, if you're really focused on this work.
Well, you make a really, really important question that we must ask, right? Folks who are saying that they're committed to racial justice work is, what are you willing to lose? Because
not even lose, just sacrifice.
Sacrifice.
Right?
Thank you.
What personal sacrifice are you willing?
Thank you for correcting me. Yes. So thank you. Very good points. Do your own work. Relationships. Put yourself out there. You can, be the person that maybe not a lot of people might know, but if you just start by saying hi, or just walking around, people will begin recognizing you. And stop with that performative wokeness, please. So now we are moving to the Q&A, and I'm gonna ask the question, and I actually would like Sean to start us off. So as a funder, or as funders, are you able to really fund differently? Even with those who look like us, who are in the positions, in grant-making positions, what are the changes that can be made? It's more than funding, more than a transaction, an overhaul of systems that become much more transformational. So what can you do?
Well, so again, it is more than just funding, right? I think when you're committed to this work, it's beyond the grant dollars that you're allocating to organizations, but it's looking at the complete set of assets that you organize, right? From where you're investing the endowment, right? Are you supporting fund managers of color? Are you de-risking those conversations? Because we're only spending 5% of our resources, and all the other dollars are sitting in the market, not necessarily doing great things. We can change that, right? And get into the investment rooms, which I think a lot of us aren't in, and we tend to shy away from that conversation. And then for us, it's everything. Every consultant that we use has to be a person of color, right? Every time we buy food for meetings, we're looking at supporting a small local minority-owned restaurant or caterer, right? But it's intentional. All these different things are intentional. Funding differently, or sort of changing. There are. We can try participatory budgeting. Once we build trust with the community and the community trusts us, then maybe we can do something like that. Or we can, just try to be creative, right? And get seek more input from organizations and community members. I think it is a work in progress, but there's so many little things that we can do that we as philanthropy typically don't. We open some cash deposits at Black banks. Everyone can do that tomorrow, right? Again, so like being committed, I think you have to look at all that you control and put in 100%.
Claribel?
So I want to be conscious of time. I'll plus one everything that Sean just said. It's about like there's funding, but then there's the relationships. There's also, like Jonathan said, there's the relationship, like the social capital we have with other funders, that we can be very intentional about our consultants and who we want to be in partnership with. I also would say, like, I'm down to overhaul the whole system, but in the meantime, like, if these are the structures that we have in place, I do believe that there are ways that we can work and navigate within them. And some of the ways that Sean mentioned are one. And I think to the point I made earlier is also like being very intentional about who you hire and bring on as program staff, because philanthropy has always historically also been very white. And so the structures and the systems and the practices and the ways of grant making, those old school ways of being, like, they're not, like, there's a reason why last year you saw a lot of different types of grant making. It was bolder. I mean, there was some bad behavior, but it was bolder. People weren't worried about reporting so much. So if we could do that in one moment in time, how can we continue to implement those changes and go a little bit further? I think if anything, the grant making, if we were to look at it 10 years from now, the grant making that happened in 2020, I would probably say was the boldest grant making that probably the philanthropic sector has probably done. So how do we continue that? Because we shouldn't be in a pandemic. We shouldn't have to see another Black man killed by the police to get there, right? We can do things today.
Thank you. So remember that you have social capital outside of your financial capital as well. And even when you're thinking about investments, where are you putting your money? It's important to think about. Jonathan, I want to ask you if you could answer the next question. How do we begin conversations about building solidarity with our African-American brothers and sisters? There's a specific example. The Cleveland Foundation announced their Black Futures Fund, and we have Latinx leaders here in Cleveland who have not have not been welcoming this initiative with open arms. They ask, what about Hispanics? How do we begin to change the narrative? We discussed that before, but any additional points?
Love the courage and the person who asked the question. I realize that we only have a minute left, but I think there is, and like I think what comes up when there is that kind of reaction to funding for the Black community in particular, I think in some ways it reflects this question around scarcity that, again, like, you know, I ran an organization around the Undocumented Black Network, built it and founded it and led it. And like, I know how hard it is to be one of those leaders, like hustling for funds and like really feeling like every dollar that I don't get, it's like a really missed opportunity to like hire staff. Like, I think for community leaders who are leading organizations, I understand why folks feel that way. And I do think that sort of really framing it around like the broader goal that we have of racial justice in this country, I think it's helpful. Like, I want for Latinx communities in Cleveland or anywhere else in the country to be free. We need Black people to be free because our lives and our journeys and our stories and all of our communities are intertwined. So I think there is a way to frame it as, hey, here, this is part of this broader fight for justice. And we'd love to just like, you know, follow up, you know, so if they want to reach out to us, happy to have more detailed conversations in private.
Well, I know that we are at time. I'm so sad. This has been amazing. Thank you all so much for sharing your brilliance with us and talk a little bit more about your experiences. Thank you everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate you all. And again, shout out to HIP and to NCRP for partnering and allowing this space to happen, to this conversation to happen. I believe they will be following up with some items and hopefully there we can give you more information about supporting Afro-Latinidad and Black-led movement. Thank you.